in his diary that the idea of the operation in the Indian Ocean was not good. The exercise suggested that it would be difficult to locate the enemy's fleet and that enemy air power would badly hinder operations. However, the results of the wargaming were apparently good enough to continue studying the operation, with increasing attention given to the capture of Ceylon. For the time being, the army was going along with the concept, and it seemed to be interested in expanding operations along the Indian front in the near future. However, within a matter of a few weeks, the bloom was apparently off the rose. Indeed, just 5 days after the exercises on Yamato wrapped up, no mention was made of such operations at a high-level liaison meeting in Tokyo. Part of this resulted from the continued reluctance on the part of the army to open a new theatre and thereby commit ground troops. Planning estimates had called for a minimum of 5 divisions for garrison duties in places like Ceylon. Not only that, but the army began to become suspicious that by committing substantial numbers of new troops to any coming Indian Ocean venture, it would undermine its previously successful strategy of being able to veto any new operation on the basis of troops simply not being available. The army suspected that the Navy might get it to commit to the Indian Ocean and then pull a bait and switch back to the Eastern Operational Front, while simultaneously demanding to use forces that were now known to be available. Given this possibility, however far-fetched, the army apparently judged that a return to sophistry was the less risky strategy. A further complicating factor was that by mid-March, the army was beginning to face up to the fact that operations in Burma were going to require more support than had been anticipated. With Rangoon having fallen on March 8th, the army was shortly to turn north to chase the British out of Burma and into India, requiring a long advance up the Irrawaddy River into very inhospitable terrain. Logistically, the army was getting near the end of its rope. The later construction of the infamous Burma Railroad was but one indication of the difficulties Japan faced in keeping pressure on India via this axis of advance. The addition of Ceylon would have vastly complicated these problems. Finally, matters were not helped by Germany's signaling that it would not carry out operations in the Middle East, aimed at securing their portion of the land bridge to Asia. This weakened the overall rationale behind an adventure in the Indian Ocean, at least from the standpoint of generating propaganda. Taken together, this option was dead by the end of March. Other than Nagumo's coming April Raiden operation that had been in the works for some time, no further moves were anticipated. So far as Army and Naval GHQ knew, the only strategic alternative now left standing was the Southwest Pacific. On 13th of March, Naval GHQ and the Army formally ratified the notion of operations against Fiji and Samoa. In this, they were further supported by Admiral Inoue, who had recently suffered 2 setbacks that argued for more attention being paid to this theatre. The first was an abortive raid on Rabaul on 20th of February by an American carrier, Lexington, under the command of Vice Admiral Wilson Brown. During the course of this action, the Americans had taught the Japanese a painful lesson concerning the vulnerability of
I'm not responding to texts. I'm very sorry, but I'm not British. Sorry about that. It's an experiment. I don't know what that is. Going back to finding the stupid Wi-Fi, just misbehaving greatly. And I'll close my eyes and maybe go to sleep while I do this, because I can.
both their aircraft and their defensive perimeter as a whole. Brown's intention was to launch a hit-and-run attack. However, his task force had been detected while still too far away to launch its aircraft. Rabaul was hardly undefended, and the base air commander had dispatched his entire group of 17 Type 1 land attack aircraft, later codenamed Betty by the Allies, from the recently activated 4th KK TIE against the American carrier. The ensuing engagement was a minor disaster. 15 of the squadron's bombers had been shot down, with no damage against the enemy to show for it. This was an ominous development indeed. Rabaul was an important installation and ought to have been able to defend itself from such a raid. That it could not cast a pall over one of Japan's basic strategic premises, namely that a perimeter buttressed by bases such as Rabaul could be defended against American incursions. Then, barely a month later, on 10th of March, came a second stunning reversal. American carriers had again appeared in southern waters and launched surprise attacks against Japanese forces making landings against the towns of Leh and Salamaua on the northern coast of New Guinea.
Hi, my name is Anne, and I would like to give you a few reasons why you should sign up for a free membership.
Making landings against the towns of Leh and Salamaua on the northern coast of New Guinea. 2 American carriers, Lexington again, along with Yorktown, both under Vice Admiral Brown, had launched 104 aircraft within sight of New Guinea's southern coast. From there, the Americans had flown across the towering Owen Stanley Mountains and then down upon the Japanese invasion forces, which were taken completely unawares. The material effects were dramatic. 2/3 of the invasion transports were either damaged or sunk. The only thing that had prevented more army casualties was the fact that many of the transports had been close to shore when the Americans attacked, allowing several of the ships to beach themselves. In psychological terms, this raid had an even larger impact than had the 4th Kokutai's mauling. The army, for its part, was horrified at the prospect of similar attacks. Likewise, Vice Admiral Inoue immediately discerned that the days of easy pickings were over in his theatre of operations. Allied resistance was stiffening, enemy air activity was on the rise, and the Americans were clearly willing to employ their carriers to contest Japanese moves in the region. Shoestring operations were no longer viable in the face of such opposition. If Inoue was to complete the southern defensive perimeter, he needed help from combined fleet to augment his tiny forces. Inoue was supported in his views by the Naval General Staff. In light of these unwholesome developments, Inoue invited a member of Combined Fleet staff to confer with him at Truk. His goal was to lobby for more support from Yamamoto. The well-travelled Captain Miwa, arriving on 13th of March, agreed with Inoue that more support was needed. But the Navy's fleet carriers were currently unavailable because they were about to enter the Indian Ocean. However, Miwa assured Inoue that a carrier division could be freed up to assist him within about a month. Inoue was encouraged by Miwa to write up a proposal and submit it to Combined Fleet. Thereupon, Miwa departed. What Inoue discovered upon submission of his proposals in early April, though, was that he had been sold a bill of goods. No carriers were forthcoming, as Yamamoto had already earmarked them for operations in early June, operations aimed at the Central Pacific. During March, unbeknownst to anyone else, Yamamoto and Ugaki had begun turning their attentions back to the Central Pacific. In the opinion of Yamamoto, the fact that American carriers had recently shown an interest in Inoue's theatre was less important than the simple fact that the Americans still had carriers at all. As such, interdicting Australian supply lines in Fiji was secondary to eliminating the naval strength that underwrote the safety of those supply lines. Consequently, Japanese operations should be aimed at their destruction. In fact, this was exactly the same objective that Yamamoto's opponent, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, intended to achieve as well. Since Yamamoto held the initiative, though, it was up to him to create the conditions whereby the Americans could be brought to battle. At this point in the war, Japan believed that the US Navy had probably been reduced to a quartet of fleet carriers in the Pacific. Lexington was believed to have been sunk early in the war by submarine attack. This left Saratoga and the 3 Yorktown-class carriers, Yorktown Enterprise and Hornet, available in the Pacific. The location of the remaining American carrier, Wasp, was unknown. The smaller Ranger, which the Japanese factored into their calculations, was believed to be in the Atlantic. This meant a theoretical maximum of 5 American carriers to deal with. However, since it was, presumably, unthinkable that the Americans would have a clear sense for Japanese intentions, it was considered equally unlikely that all 5 would be in the same location when the Japanese attacked. Yamamoto was confident that with all 6 of his large carriers, Nagumo could deal with any enemy force he encountered. It is perhaps not surprising that the destruction of America's carriers had taken on such a heavy dose of symbolism in Yamamoto's eyes. The mere existence of these vessels, effective or not, illustrated the absurdity of the war Japan had gotten itself into. While Japan's initial victories had been spectacular, they had also been ultimately empty, in that the war-making potential of the United States remained intact. It was true that America had been expelled from its Pacific dominions, and that its navy had been battered and humiliated at Pearl Harbor. But the Americans were still willing to fight, and had declared that nothing short of total victory would satisfy their war aims against Japan. Herein lay the fundamental strategic conundrum that now faced the Japanese: how to force to the negotiating table an enemy who, although wounded, was both vastly more powerful in the long term and in the short term had demonstrated a furious disinclination to bargain. Likewise, Japan had to grapple with the question of how to secure, once and for all, the economic underpinnings of its new empire against an enemy whose economy was not only much larger, but also largely untouchable. Clear-cut as these problems may have been, the potential solution was far from obvious. In fact, it probably didn't exist. Having initiated the war with a surprise attack, it was almost certainly beyond her means to cajole the Americans to the table, no matter what military setbacks she subsequently foisted on her adversary. Given the lack of readily identifiable exit strategies, Admiral Yamamoto's answer to continue offensive operations aimed at the destruction of the American fleet was predictable, and yet ultimately empty. Yamamoto was convinced that the best way to lure the American carriers out was to attack an objective the Americans could not relinquish without a fight. As related previously, his first notion had been to attack Hawaii directly. But American strength on the Hawaiian Islands had ballooned since the time of December 7th, and the seas and skies around them were now too heavily patrolled to allow a repeat visit from Nagumo on anything like the favourable terms he had achieved in December. Yet Yamamoto reasoned that an attack against an intermediate objective that placed Hawaii in danger would be met with a vigorous American response. At the same time, the objective needed to be outside the range of US air power stationed in Hawaii, thereby curtailing its ability to intervene directly in the battle. The place of attack he selected was the island of Midway. Aptly named, it sat in the middle of the Pacific at the far tip of the Hawaiian chain, some 100-300 miles northwest of Oahu. On the face of it, Yamamoto's objective hardly seemed worth a good bar fight, let alone a decisive sea battle. Midway was a tiny atoll, composed of 2 islands, Sand and Easton, surrounded by a coral reef. Both islands together comprised less than 2 square miles of real estate. Eastern Island, the smaller of the 2, was almost totally covered by the 3 crisscrossing landing strips of an American airbase. Japanese intelligence estimated that 50-odd aircraft were operating from it. Sand Island held the majority of the shore facilities, barracks, and the new American seaplane base. This installation, which the Americans had completed just prior to the war at the then staggering cost of $20 million, hosted a number of Catalina PBY flying boats that patrolled the seas in all directions. However, given the diminutive size of Midway itself, there was little chance that the Americans could operate a very large air group there, no matter how much money they poured into its facilities. The value of Midway lay not in the intrinsic value of its facilities, but rather in its location. Capturing Midway would allow the Japanese to establish themselves within the Hawaiian Islands. Midway could theoretically be used as a springboard for future operations aimed at the conquest of Hawaii itself, although its practical value as an advanced base was limited. However, holding Midway would enable the Japanese to intercept American raiding forces operating in the empty expanse of waters north and west of the Hawaiian Islands. It would also prevent the island from being used by the Americans for attacks against Wake. As such, Yamamoto reasoned that the Americans would be compelled to fight for it. Given that the Naval General Staff was still behind the Fiji-Samoa option, and combined fleets supported the Central Pacific option, things were bound to come to a head once GHQ became aware of Yamamoto's rekindled intentions. A series of staff meetings in Tokyo during April 5, 1942, was the venue for the showdown between the two camps. The battle was fought by proxy, with both sides using staff officers to duke it out, while Yamamoto remained sequestered on board Yamato at Hashirajima. At Naval GHQ, Yamamoto's errand boy, Captain Watanabe Yasuji, laid out combined fleet's proposal to the assembled officers. Yamamoto's scheme was immediately taken under fire by Admiral Fukudome's three top planners, Captain Tomioka and his two leading subordinates, Commanders Yamamoto Yuji and Mio Tatsukichi. Commander Mio, himself an air officer and classmate of Watanabe's from Staff College, was particularly well suited to commenting on Admiral Yamamoto's plan. He promptly meted out a withering criticism. Mio's critique was based on three fundamentally sound objections. The first was that in attempting to attack Midway, the Navy would be reversing the formula that had worked so well during the previous months. In the opening operations of the war, the Japanese had advanced under the cover of land-based air power, quickly establishing themselves at captured bases and moving the air umbrella forward. In this new operation, though, they would be attacking across the Pacific without such support. By the same token, Midway was itself an outpost of a far larger enemy bastion, Oahu, which could support it with relative ease. Midway was within range of American heavy bombers, but was too far from Hawaii to allow Japanese fighter aircraft to extend their own sphere of influence.
Hey, it's JD Vance. If you can't afford to donate because of the wreckage of Joe Biden's economy, I understand and want you to.
It was too far from Hawaii to allow Japanese fighter aircraft to extend their own sphere of influence over the main islands. It is important to recall that at this stage in the development of naval aviation, conducting extended carrier operations in the face of enemy land-based air power was infeasible. Kido Butai couldn't stand off a hostile enemy base and hope to wear it down through attrition. This capability, the very definition of the true carrier task force, would not be created until later in the war, when the US Navy brought its vastly superior logistics capabilities to bear. Kido Butai, although powerful, was a raiding force, and this is exactly how the Japanese understood its usage. Once Midway was captured, Nagumo would be forced to retire and replenish. At that point, Midway would be on its own, exposed to Hawaii-based air and sea power. This led directly to the second point. Even if Midway was captured, it was unlikely that it could be supported, particularly in the face of concerted enemy submarine attack. The Japanese merchant marine was already overtaxed. Japan had begun the war at a disadvantage in that many of her imports had previously been carried in either neutral or allied ships. When war was declared, Japan in effect lost millions of tons worth of shipping overnight. These difficulties were compounded by the need to support the military's troop transport missions, which pulled more tonnage out of service to the civilian economy. Unnecessarily impacting this already overstretched network was to be avoided at all costs. The truth was that every mile that Japan's defensive perimeter expanded placed an additional 2 miles of burden on the nation's shipping, because ships not only had to go out to the newly captured base, but also had to return. Given that there was nothing on Midway even vaguely worth transporting home, those ships would return empty. Every mile travelled in ballast, of course, lowered the overall efficiency of Japan's merchant marine still further. As a result, shipping difficulties increased at a geometric rate in relation to the distance of the defensive perimeter from the home islands. Whether or not Mio understood this problem in precisely this fashion is unlikely, but he and his fellow staff officers could tell instantly that keeping the island in supply would be exceedingly difficult. Mio also correctly pointed out that Midway itself was tiny and could only support a small air group. thus mitigating its usefulness as an advance base to be used against the hundreds of American aircraft known to be on Hawaii. Yet, even keeping a diminutive air group operating in the face of such opposition would be difficult. Midway was so small that dispersing aircraft would be impossible. This raised the spectre of suffering outsized aircraft losses on the ground in the event of American bombing. Mio knew that aircraft shortages were already a serious problem in the fleet. How did Yamamoto propose to keep Midway supplied with aircraft given the likely attrition rates it would suffer? In the same vein, Mio doubted that sufficient aviation gasoline could be provided. Japan's stock of tankers was small, and most were already tied up supporting the fleet or transporting crude oil from the southern resource areas back to the home islands. Keeping aircraft operating on Midway would require a major logistics effort, a fact that Yamamoto's proposals ignored. Mio's third and final critique was that attacking Midway would not provoke the type of reaction from the Americans that Yamamoto blandly assumed. In Mio's opinion, Midway was superfluous to the ultimate defense of Hawaii, for the very reasons just laid out. The Americans could afford to cede their outlying outpost and then reclaim it whenever the Japanese logistical thread showed signs of fraying. In the meantime, Japan's ownership would not jeopardize Hawaii's position in the slightest. Why, Mio asked, would the Americans react as violently as Yamamoto assumed they would over such an insignificant speck of land? In Mio's opinion, and that of the Naval General Staff, launching operations that severed American communications with Australia were far more likely to provoke the needed reaction. If the Americans were serious about using Australia as a base for future operations, and their recent commitment of carriers to this area indicated that this was so, they could not help but respond vigorously to any threat to its supply lines. Furthermore, a campaign in this region of the Pacific, while distant from Japan, would at least place an equal burden of distance on the Americans. Precipitating combat near Hawaii handed the Americans the advantage of fighting from interior lines. It seems clear that Watanabe found himself in an unenviable position. Unable to counter Mio's arguments, he was on the verge of angry tears. The truth was that Mio's critique was far better thought out than Yamamoto's plan. Despite being flustered, though, Watanabe refused to be lured into an argument against Mio's well-reasoned objections. Instead, he simply restated Combined Fleet's position by rote, presenting its arguments as incontrovertible fact. This inability to engage Yamamoto's lackey in any form of rational discourse soured Tomioka and Mio's moods still further. In the end, under increasing pressure from GHQ, Watanabe was forced to appeal to his chief to intercede. Placing a call to Yamato, Watanabe asked Yamamoto to comment on Mio's alternative proposal for actions in the Southwest Pacific. Yamamoto replied that the most effective way of severing the American lines of communication was to destroy the means whereby these lines were maintained, namely their carriers. He also argued that in the unlikely event that the Americans did not bite at Midway, Japan would win a bloodless victory there that extended the defensive perimeter outward. Yamamoto, in other words, was unmoved. Furthermore, the manner of his delivery and his unflinching support for an aide who had just been logically dismembered made it clear that he was prepared once again to resign unless he got his way. The Naval General Staff, having already lost this game once, was in a much worse position to call Yamamoto's bluff this time, particularly in light of Yamamoto's successes over the previous months. Predictably, when push came to shove, the Naval General Staff caved in once more. The men in a position to actually do something about Yamamoto's near insubordination Fukudome and Nagano apparently did nothing to defend their subordinates against what was, in essence, a coup against their own authority. Nagano thereupon grudgingly ratified Yamamoto's basic operational plan on 5th April. All that remained now was for Yamamoto's staff to work out the details. As one historian has noted,